Now, I'd like to interview as well, but I'd like to welcome Dr. Parag Khanna. He's the Director of Global Governance Initiative of New America Foundation. A little bit about him. He's an author of several books, including one on how to run the world, charting the course to the next renaissance. He's also an international relations expert who also contributes quite frequently to television channels like the BBC, as well as newspapers. Now, he's going to talk about understanding Asia in the new world order, after which we will have a panel session. Please put your hands together for Dr. Parag Khanna.
Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm very honored to be here with all of you today. I see you're having a really intense and but warm gathering. I think alumni communities like this are so much a part of what people think of today when they think of India, this sense of community. So I'm really delighted to be here today to provide, I guess, what you could call a geopolitical interlude, if you will. And I think it's important to do this because geopolitics and the conflict scenarios, some of which I'll talk about today, can obviously put a real brake on some of the ambitions, commercial and economic, that we have and that we're talking about. But done right, diplomatic alliances can also create enormous opportunities that can reinforce those visions. So let me give you a sweeping tour, in a way, of where Asia stands and where India stands within that picture. But I'll take a step back just 20 years to what was called the unipolar moment of the 1990s. And you all remember that feeling when the Cold War ended, the United States was the world's only superpower. There was a sense, a belief that that situation would remain the case for decades hence, that all other powers would have to route their relations around the United States and so forth. And very few disputed that vision. China was seen as just a rising regional power, but certainly not a global superpower. And India was not considered a serious global player either. So much has changed in the last 20 years. The diagram of power that I depict here is no longer really relevant at all. I think that the map of power looks a lot more like this, what I call the global marketplace. Somehow in my slides getting emailed over here, some of these lines got quite distorted. Pretend it is a symmetrical matrix of a lattice connecting these regions. Now, what you'll notice here is some very substantial differences from the 1990s image to today. Again, in a very short amount of time. You can see that there is no one center. There is no one global hegemon that drives global geopolitical affairs. You'll also see that every region is here on the map. There was a time very recently when we could talk about the future of globalization and neglect to talk about Africa, neglect to talk about Latin America. No longer is that the case. Every single region is really represented in the future world order. And third, and perhaps most important, every region can connect to any other region without having to ask permission from Washington or London or Paris or Moscow. And these axes, these lines of connectivity, are the drivers of globalization today. As you know, the majority of global growth and the majority of trade in cross-border, majority of growth in cross-border trade and so forth is coming from these connections across emerging markets. Whereas people in the United States and Europe are living in a time of relative economic stagnation and dwindling growth, which is why the US and the EU are talking about trying to at least boost to some extent their bilateral relationship through a free trade area. We're talking about 1,500% growth in economic relations between China and Africa, 800% growth in the last decade between India and Africa, and so on and so on. So where you see any two regions connecting with each other, that is globalization as well. But it's not globalization being driven by the West anymore. In fact, to a large extent, it's being driven by Asia. But Asia, even absent that growing connectivity with the rest of the world, is really a world unto itself, of course. The majority of the world's population is right here. Now, there are many definitions of Asia, geographic, cultural, and otherwise. I've created a very expansive depiction here, all the way from the Middle East, all the way to the Russian Far East, from the Arctic to the Antarctic. In fact, Australia's military doctrine is called the three-ocean strategy: Indian Ocean, Pacific Ocean, and Antarctic Ocean as well. And in fact, the United Arab Emirates and a number of Gulf countries have India as their largest trading partner. A country like the UAE is trying to fashion itself in a way as the Singapore of the Middle East. So there is this Asianization going on that makes this region very pivotal to the future of the world. However, we should be very cautious about Asian triumphalism. You've probably heard many speeches in which people say that China is replacing America, the East is replacing the West, the Pacific is displacing the Atlantic. None of those things are actually true. Many books are written about making those claims, and that is what I call Asian triumphalism, and it's very, very dangerous. Let me ask you a question. When was the last time you heard the phrase peak oil? It's probably been a while, but it was something that we took for granted for quite a long time. We assumed that that's where we were going. But as you know very well, that's no longer the case, and you've probably heard about the shale gas revolution in the Western Hemisphere, particularly in the United States. And therefore, you cannot count out the West. One discovery, one technology of fracking of shale gas can lead to an entirely different geopolitical picture than the one we had in our heads about the demise of the West just a few years ago. Because in fact, the West, and the way I've characterized it here as being North America, South America, and Europe, not just the transatlantic community, is a zone of peace. It is a zone of enormous economic weight. And it is a zone of energy self-sufficiency, natural resource self-sufficiency. That, in fact, makes the West, far from being counted out, still an integral part of the future of world order. And what is more important then is, rather than to paint a picture of East-West rivalry, is to show the overlapping that is going on. And that's what's interesting today. I talked about these relationships between emerging market regions. Areas like Africa and the Middle East that were once considered the West's backyard are now truly open to business for everyone. And that's something that Indian companies have discovered a long time ago, of course, going back to colonial times, but are rediscovering today. And I think that this zone of overlap is where the geopolitical picture gets very interesting. Now, coming back to Asia, as I mentioned, the West is a zone of peace. World War III is not going to take place in the Western Hemisphere. It's not going to break out between Brazil and America. For us in Asia who want to believe that Asia has a bright future as the pillar of world order that can drive the global economy, we have a lot of questions to answer, which is, why is it that with this incredibly dense hodgepodge of diplomatic institutions, we are in a phase of unprecedented uncertainty, fear, about geopolitical stability in Asia? In short, we've created diplomacy here in Asia without unity. There is ASEAN, ASEAN +3, the ASEAN Regional Forum, the East Asian Community. The list of acronyms goes on and spills well beyond this slide. And yet, we can clearly see that, again, the level of tension in the region is higher than at any time in recent memory. And of course, one reason for that is that going back about 3 or 4 years, one has sensed that palpably that China has begun to overreach diplomatically and strategically. There have been disputes and continue to be very sharp disputes with Japan, with the Philippines, Vietnam, and other countries. Now, China actually borders more countries than any other in the entire world. And so the period of frictionless commercial expansion that they had achieved over the last 10 to 15 years have been notably reversed, and the tensions have ratcheted up on every country on the border. I've spent the last 10 or so years traveling to just about every country on that border, including North Korea, Mongolia, Kazakhstan, Russia, and everywhere I've felt the beginning of this anti-Chinese blowback, if you will. That creates tensions, but also creates opportunities, and I certainly want to talk about both. But most certainly there is a sense that a conflict between China and Japan, or a disruption of passage of energy and other resources through the South China Sea and the Straits of Malacca, could be hugely disruptive, of course, to the Asian growth paradigm. Now, if Asia does want to prove itself as a self-governing region that doesn't need Western tutelage, it's going to have to think about how to solve its own problems and think beyond the pivot to Asia, the United States coming and rebalancing things in the region and so forth. We have to have strategic maturity. And I would propose one simple idea here, just very briefly, and it goes back 100 years to something that happened after World War I, which is the ways in which Svalbard Island in the Arctic Sea was ceded in a way to Norway. But what Norway did was to say, well, we don't own or dominate this island exclusively. We will be its stewards. We will provide, we will maintain environmental sustainability here. We will allow the passage of ships around. We will be non-discriminatory in the commercial access to the resources of the island, and we will not allow any militarization of this island. And to this day, that is what Norway does in this situation with Svalbard Island. So you can clearly see the lessons for the Spratly Islands in the South China Sea dispute. Why do we need here in Asia to have an external hegemon come with a powerful navy to maintain balance? Why can there not be a diplomatic process, or I would argue a commercial process, whereby the national oil companies in this region jointly exploit the mineral resources of the South China Sea, create a joint stock company, a joint exploration company to share in those fruits. And again, as I mentioned, have that be something that is run jointly by energy companies so that the political disputes that are leading to such tension can be marginalized. So we have to think creatively and diplomatically as a region, as a whole, in order to make sure that the economic story that we're trying to tell actually becomes a reality. Now, there has been this backlash, if you will, growing against China, but China has also been very persistent. And it's been persistent in doing things that we have hoped that India would do more of, because I heard this mentioned already twice this morning. And that is in building infrastructural corridors with its neighbors, both maritime and on land. Many of you have heard this phrase, the string of pearls, which refers to China's establishment of naval bases on its periphery and even, so to speak, encircling India. You may have even followed in the news just a few weeks ago that China took over operations of the Gwadar port in Pakistan, something that it's had its eye on for a very long time. And that is also one of these nodes in this string of pearls. And it has done so also over land. A very large component of China's stimulus has been investments in railways and rail infrastructure, both municipal, metropolitan, as well as high-speed rail projects taking place across the country, and even across borders, through Central Asia, through Russia, and so forth. India has unfortunately been largely excluded from this paradigm of infrastructural fusion that is taking place across Eurasia. And that's unfortunate because it presents a massive economic opportunity. Imagine what happens when these railways and roads and pipelines are developed all the way across Eurasia, the movement of people, of goods, capital, investment, and so forth. So Eurasia is knitting itself together, and India, for a variety of reasons, has been cutting itself off or has been cut off from those developments. And I've been quite on record in all of my books and being quite, I wouldn't say negative, but certainly cynical about the Indian triumphalism, the India shining rhetoric going back about 10 years. And for better or worse, I've been proven right because we have under-delivered. India, this is the cover of The Economist, as I'm sure you all saw from just 2 weeks ago. And I really believe this question should have been answered by now, and unfortunately it hasn't. And the things that The Economist article points to are incredibly obvious sorts of steps and measures, many of which have again been mentioned this morning by the previous speakers. But let me go into a little bit of detail. One of the things they highlight, and one of the things that contradicts the last 15 years, or going back since the end of the Cold War, projections or strategy of the Indian establishment. Originally, the goal and the vision that even the Pentagon had for India was to be this land-based continental rival to a rising China. And what that did, unfortunately, was to draw attention away from India's natural position as a naval power, presiding over the Indian Ocean, controlling the most important sea lines of communication in the entire world, and really this maritime Silk Road, as many call it, between the Middle East and the Far East. Now, it's fortunately not too late to emphasize that naval modernization. India has spent only about 1/3 as much on its Navy as it has on other services, such as the Army. But that certainly, there's plenty of room for growth there. So India's grand strategy moving forward has to, in short, focus, yes, on its army and its land forces, but very much on its navy, and it has to look both east and west. And I want to go in both directions briefly. Looking west. I've long been a supporter of the green and the red lines depicted here on this map, and these, of course, represent the TAPI and IPI pipeline projects. There's a lot of concern about these initiatives. There's been a lot of efforts made by the United States and other powers to dissuade India from participating. Iran and Pakistan themselves, through their own diplomatic actions, have made a good case for not getting involved. But in the long term, it is, given India's natural resource demand, and given the fact that for all of the tension that we see today with Iran, all of the talk of war and so forth, one way or the other, I imagine within the next 5 years, certainly within 10 years, Iran is going to be open for business. I can't even tell you the number of business leaders, American and otherwise, who have to speak quietly about this, but they confide in anyone who will listen that Iran is for them the next growth market that they are targeting. They see it as one of the most important future markets for growth. And indeed it will be, if you think about the infrastructural neglect in that country and the size of its population, not to mention its geographic position, which makes it so hard to isolate, and its natural resource wealth, which are very, very important for India to access. So the IPI pipeline is something that India should be more aggressively looking at. And then the Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan pipeline as well. These are both extremely important aspects of a look west policy, as much as we're also talking about looking east. So that, of course, means some degree of deepening commercial integration with Pakistan, some of which is beginning to take place with the granting of most favored nation or favored nation trade status and so forth. But these kinds of deep linkages, physical linkages across borders, are far more important than what you read about in the newspapers, whether or not Karzai, what is the fate of Karzai after 2014 and so forth, and what are the linkages between politicians, between India and Afghanistan, and the historical friendship between India and Afghanistan. Those things don't matter at all compared to this, compared to actually building the long-term physical connections that link the markets. And so that means through Pakistan, through Afghanistan, and beyond. And this is what serious long-term infrastructural commitment is about. That's what I've shown you China is doing through its naval investments and its railway investments. And in order for India to be a geopolitical player in Eurasia, it absolutely has to do the same thing. The same logic does apply to the east. I was pleased to hear earlier this morning emphasis on building out the roads and connections in India's northeast to Myanmar. I've been spending quite a bit of time there, and again, despite the fact that it was one country up until less than 100 years ago, you can feel very little impact of the Indian business community in Myanmar. Again, cultural connectivity, historical ties and linkages, fine. Day-to-day business reality, that means very, very, very little. The fact is there are very few flights per week that connect India to Myanmar. There's almost no contact over land. All of that needs to change, and it needs to change very fast. And again, this is the right time for India to be looking east precisely because of the fact that there is this backlash and this tension and this suspicion and fear of China. This is the opportunity. A country like Myanmar, whose economy or whose FDI was dominated so heavily by China, is looking to diversify. It's welcoming in the United States, Europe, India, and just about anyone. In fact, there is an expression, ABC, anyone but China, at this point. In Mongolia, a country that is landlocked and surrounded by two countries, Russia and China, Mongolia's official foreign policy is called the third neighbor strategy. They just want to have a third neighbor, and they want it to not be China or Russia. So in country after country around the world where you see that China has taken on an overwhelming share of a country's foreign investment or trade, you find this fear that they are being dominated too much and that they need to diversify. So this is the right time for India to be looking east to those emerging markets. There's growing relations, of course, with Singapore, with Indonesia, with Vietnam. Japan has been mentioned as a major source of FDI. It's important not to disappoint those investors as well as one seeks to build those relations. My final point is about not just looking east and west, but in all directions. The essence of success in diplomacy is no longer about who you align with in terms of choosing one side or the other. That was the 19th century, that was the 20th century, that was the Cold War. You'd pick the East or the West, right? You pick the US or the Soviet Union. There, of course, India was non-aligned, but non-alignment doesn't really function as a strategy in the 21st century. I think successful diplomacy in this age is going to be about multi-alignment, which means, of course, if you take the example of the BRICS summit, playing all sides. This was 2 weeks ago in South Africa. And the BRICS summit is a good example of this. Reaching out to the United States, yes, of course, the United States is a growing trade partner of India. It is a growing provider of military hardware. We've spoken about China as a partner as well, as a major source of long-term capital. Russia is still a defense supplier. So India should be looking in any and all directions for its partnerships and not being exclusive about any one of them. At the BRICS summit, there was talk of setting up a development bank, an investment bank, and other sorts of joint projects. But here's the single most important thing I want to emphasize, and I'll end on this point. Here you see an image of statesmen. But the image of India today in the world is, as I said at the beginning, not really tied to its statesmen or to its military. You know, the reason India is considered a great power today has to do with its commercial face. Right, with its technological face, with its entrepreneurs, with its technologists, not with its diplomats. Shashi Tharoor actually pointed out in his new book, Pax Indica, Singapore has more foreign service officers than India. So the truth is that the success of India as a global player depends not on its military, depends not on its diplomacy. I absolutely fundamentally believe it depends on all of you. Thank you very much.
Marvelous. There you have it. These are the gifts. And as mentioned again, they are from Protsahan, the NGO. And all the speakers will be receiving these today. Thank you. Wonderful. Well, I'd like to invite